Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Well, I always maintain that despite the fact it sometimes seems that way, it's not really mission impossible. We're joined by our friend Richard Kazimer from the United States. How are you this morning, my friend?
My pathetic life is always that much the richer when I'm talking to you.
Oh, God, don't bother crawling to me, son. It won't get you anywhere. I got nothing to give.
I've gotten this far, and this is actually good enough. Thank you for that.
Oh, well, that's always the main thing. Hey, listen, it's one of these topics, I suppose, in some respects, arguably, we should have visited it much sooner, but we more or less touched upon it last week by accident. It's the issue, that three-letter word that really gets people going in the United States, or at least it appears to from this side of the world, I can tell you, and that word is gun, or, if we want to make it four-letter word, guns. It seems to be one of those things. We've all heard about the Second Amendment, even those of us who don't live in the United States. Well, what's the real story about guns as far as you're concerned?
The U.S. has had quite a gun heritage. The gun was an essential part of U.S. history in taming this wild country, in both in peacetime and in our internal wars. Manufacturers like Smith & Wesson, Remington, Winchester, Ruger, and Colt are very iconic in names of quality firearms around the world, but particularly here in the U.S. And as one cowboy said, God didn't make men equal, Mr. Colt did. Now, how many guns are there in the United States is a number that has been thrown around for years, and it always seems to be that there's one or two or even three guns per every man, woman, and child in this country. Now, if you figure that there's an estimated 350 million people living here in the United States, that's a lot of guns. In trying to find out where that number came from, it's almost impossible because the Department of Justice doesn't verify that. It's often quoted by both sides on the gun issue, whether you're a proponent or an opponent of gun rights, gun laws, gun possession. The National Rifle Association uses that number to protect gun rights. People who are opposed to gun rights say there's too many guns out there. So there's really no tangible reference point to how many guns are actually out there. The other thing that makes that kind of an intangible is that we don't have a national gun registry system. So once a gun leaves the manufacturer, when it has that serial number, all guns have serial numbers on them. That serial number that goes from the manufacturer and then to the first retailer who sells it. That retailer then quotes that serial number when they legally sell that gun. Once that gun is owned by a person, there is no tracing of that gun unless that person registers that gun with their local police department or their state. Here in the United States, you are not required to register your gun with any law enforcement agency. Again, that number is an intangible. The other thing is that collectors and gun enthusiasts often own multiple guns. It's not unusual for a gun collector to own hundreds of guns. The average gun owner may own a hunting rifle, a handgun, antique guns. Another quote is that 1 in 4 people own a firearm, which again is kind of ludicrous because if you consider an older community, like in Florida, for example, where the average age is 65 to death, I doubt very much if 1 in 4 of those people are owning a handgun. So how many guns are out there? Who knows? There's definite demarcation between a legal gun owner and a legal gun user and the illegal gun owner and how they've possessed their guns.
Well, I suppose one of the big issues that really comes to play there is the fact that clearly nobody seems to know. If I said to you, find out how many registered cars there are in the United States, if I give you a day, you could come back and you could give me the figures. Actually, you probably could do it sooner because you'd probably be able to find the information online. Yet, when it comes to how many registered firearms are there, you don't know. And nobody knows. Yet, we could easily find out how many registered motor cars there are. Why is it so?
It goes back to the Second Amendment right. We're not protected under the Constitution to own a vehicle, like we talked about last week on drinking alcohol. But you are protected under the Second Amendment to own and bear arms. Now, the wording of that is subject. If I could just briefly read this, the Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Proponents of gun rights say that means people, capital P, means that everybody has the right to keep and bear arms. Opponents of that say that it's capital M, militia, which we no longer require, because when the Constitution and the Second Amendment was written, we didn't have a national armed forces. Each of the communities had their own militia. So it was important that the militias had the right to keep and bear arms, not individual people.
I must say, I've always read the Second Amendment as distinguishing the people from the militia and saying that the people can bear arms as well as the militia. That's how I've always read that.
That's been a bone of contention for many, many years, for hundreds of years, as to what exactly does it mean. Now, recently, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gun rights proponents in Chicago, because Chicago had banned the possession of firearms, of handguns, rather. And the Supreme Court recently overturned that, saying individual cities in individual states cannot deny the rights of legal gun owners. The NRA jumped on that, and now they're going to file suit in all the major cities, including Boston and all over this country, to overturn that. So this is the first time in a long time where there's been a clear definition by the Supreme Court as to whether it's capital M militia, small p people, capital P people, and small m militia. So I think that unless there's another overturning or an overruling of the Supreme Court, you're going to see individuals be able to purchase handguns, specifically handguns. These rules do not necessarily apply to rifles, because you can go in and buy a rifle. Hunting is a big culture here. So it's easier to purchase and own a rifle than it is a handgun. Their laws are different in every single state. There's as many gun laws in the United States as there are calibers of weapons. You have to be 21 or older to buy a handgun, but you can be 18 years old to buy a rifle, but not necessarily a shotgun. Depending on where you live, that regulates your ownership and your rights to buy and to keep firearms. Each state has their own thing. Each community has their own rules, so it is very varied. And therein lies the rub of how confusing our country is as far as gun rights are. And it's not something that the House and Senate want to tackle, because it's just like putting smoke back in the bottle. It's easier to regulate things before you do it, but it's hard to do takeaway, especially if you've got in excess of 350 million guns out there. Then how are they going to get them that nobody knows where they are?
The bottom line really in the United States is no politician of any persuasion at any time is going to pull it on with groups like the NRA. I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting that you and I have had this conversation this morning, and to thus far, no mention has been made of the issue of gun safety or the horrendous rate of gun deaths in the United States.
That's something I looked into years ago, is about the rate of gun deaths. That's always a figure that's bandied about as well. That also doesn't have any sort of concrete resource and concrete validation. I checked with the Department of Justice on how many people die each year or have died over the past 10 years due to gun violence or gun deaths. The Department of Justice has these figures, and they don't break it down to gun assaults. Everybody who died by guns, that also includes suicides, hunting accidents, gun cleaning accidents, police killing people, criminals killing people. So there is no tangible number that determines how many people have died violently from a gun attack here in the United States.
Well, it's a case
so
of...
there's another thing that we really can't fall back on.
Well, I mean, it's a case of how many people have died. I mean, I can get you those figures because I got them myself.
How many people have died from guns, but how many people have died from guns shot by police, shot by another hunter, for example? That breakdown does not exist.
I'll give you the latest figures I've got, and this is in total, between Australia and the United States. In 2005, in the United States, there were 30,364 gun deaths, which takes into account everything of which you've spoken. Everything ranging from homicides to suicides to accidental shootings, the whole bit, right? In Australia, the figure was 70. Now, bearing in mind that America has 11 times Australia's population, we would have to get some idea of a comparison between the two, we'd have to multiply the Australian figure by 11. Agreed?
Exactly.
Right. 770 versus 30,364 for the year 2005. In Great Britain, if a comparison is made between Great Britain and the United States, in the same year, Great Britain had 42 gun deaths. Now, Great Britain's got approximately 1/5 of the United States population, so if I multiply that figure by 5, the answer is 210. So therefore, you'd have to say that there is an issue there, isn't there? I mean, it seems to be something, I mean, I accept that it's something that's very much entrenched in the culture, but you can understand why people outside of the United States really think that there truly is an issue that needs to be addressed with the gun culture in the United States.
Well, we could argue that the people in the United States are better shots than you are in Australia or in the UK.
Yeah, we could also argue that we don't shoot people like you do.
Well, this is true. But a gun is a weapon of convenience. If we have more people and therefore more guns that are easily accessible, then therefore that is going to be the first weapon of choice. I read pretty much a weekly basis in the Australian press where there are axe murderers, knife murderers, because those are the weapons of convenience. I don't know if it's necessarily apples and oranges, but how many of those gun deaths were of people that were legal gun owners? How many were related to gang violence?
All of that is relevant, but of course all of that also applies in the same figures you get here. So therefore, I mean, all of that is relevant, but it's always interesting, and once again I find it very interesting this morning that having a conversation with someone like yourself, it really seems to me that one thing the US does collectively is have a great deal of difficulties getting its head around the fact that it really does have a problem with guns.
I think because it has a lot to do with our culture, that it's been out there for 300 years, that we've always had guns.
Well, I'll put it to you, as a person who was born in the United States and has lived there most of your life, you've never known it any different. To you, it's normal. You've never known it any different.
That's true.
And neither did your grandfather, for that matter.
Both of my grandfathers were not born in this country.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I suppose with a surname like yours, that probably pretty well guarantees that. Look, one of the other things that's also patently obvious to anyone outside of the United States is that gun politics is a very prickly issue, that no political party wants to touch it, that groups like the National Rifle Association carry an awful lot of power, and that people see, and it seems to me that I guess many people in the United States can quote you the Constitution, and I'll bet you those self-same people are not people who necessarily know too much about the Constitution, but they sure as hell know that they've got the right to bear arms. Is it something, especially when it comes to regulation and the fact that, of course, guns would obviously be the first weapon of choice and probably fairly easy to obtain for criminals, is there an argument to say that there should at least be some level of gun control?
First off, the National Rifle Association is indeed a powerful lobby group. Now, they solely represent the interest of the gun manufacturer, not the gun owner. The NRA gives the impression that it's protecting the gun owner's Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, but you cannot own a gun unless you buy a gun from someone who makes a gun. In every political cycle, the NRA creates a straw man argument to demonize anybody who identifies anti-gun rights by creating fear in any particular party or president as saying that they're going to come out and take your guns away and or your ammunition. It's nothing more than a marketing ploy to get people to go out and buy guns immediately and buy more ammunition. We actually had an ammunition shortage here during the last presidential campaign because the NRA was coming out saying that Obama was going to take away the guns. And it is just not valid.
It's not constitutionally possible anyway.
No, it's not. In a lot of marketing is that you always shoot, no pun intended, for the lowest common denominator, or in as far as elections are concerned, what we call the LIV, the low information voter, who doesn't do a lot, doesn't do any research.
Yeah, but I mean, all of that sort of thing is always going to come into play. But what about looking at it from the other angle? Has anyone ever seriously talked about saying, well, you know something, maybe we need to sit down and re-look at this in light of the times in which we live? Which obviously would involve a referendum. And has anyone ever talked about that?
Occasionally it'll come up that there is a ban on assault weapons. You cannot legally purchase a fully automatic weapon. You can buy an AK-47, but it is a semi-automatic version of it. You can't buy a Thompson submachine gun, for example, or anything like that. You can buy a semi-automatic weapon, but you cannot buy a fully automatic weapon. There are, however, kits you can buy legally, and some of them skirt the legal issue, that you can convert a semi-automatic weapon to an automatic weapon. That is a problem. There are cop killer bullets that have been banned, bullets that are coated with titanium or Kevlar that go through bulletproof vests that the police have. There are those kind of laws that are introduced and often passed, but here too the NRA will come out and say, how dare you infringe on our rights to purchase any type of weapon or ammunition. What the NRA says, I think that everyone can agree on, there's a difference between your rights and your responsibility, that the NRA will say that we don't need more stringent laws to impede the legal gun owner. We need to strictly enforce the existing laws to prevent illegal guns, illegal gun possession, illegal use. That's where that line is drawn in the sand.
Well, it strikes me that might be a bridge too far in any case because there are just so many guns out there in the marketplace. But here's the other rub. Has anyone ever bothered to sit down and say, well, maybe the gun manufacturers need to be sued? I mean, you live in a country where, let's put it this way, litigation seems to be a second sport behind baseball and football. You kind of think that somewhere along the line somebody would be ready to pull it on with the gun manufacturers.
Gun manufacturers manufacturers have been sued, some successfully, some lawsuits have been overturned by gun manufacturers producing a weapon of mass killing capability. I know that during the Columbine High School shooting, there were lawsuits against the manufacturers of those guns that those two students obtained through another loophole in our laws where they were underage and they actually went to a gun show, which is basically a flea market for gun owners, and they purchased those automatic weapons there legally or through the cracks or who knows, but that's how they got their possession. So and any time you see a mass killing, families of victims go and sue the gun manufacturers. There was a few years back an effort, and I believe Smith & Wesson actually did it, to try to produce a single gun owner trigger so that it would only shoot if your fingerprint was on it. That technology is available. It pretty much renders the gun useless. It's too high tech, and it takes away the whole purpose of the gun and the comfort of the gun. I know these sound kind of strange things to be saying about a weapon, especially a handgun, where a handgun is only designed to kill another person. People don't use handguns over here regularly as a hunting weapon. A handgun is to protect and to kill another person. And that fell by the wayside. I think Smith & Wesson's dropped doing that. There's no legal requirement for any of the handgun manufacturers to do that. But sitting down and putting the smoke back in the bottle, it's just an impossibility. Nobody's going to do it. When you hear the right, for example, use the straw man argument that the Democrats are going to take away your gun rights, and then you don't hear the Democrats counter that because it is a straw man argument. It doesn't exist. The Democrats are not trying to take away your gun rights. There are groups like the people who formed the Brady Bill to regulate do more gun control. They're actually disappointed in President Obama for not being strong enough on gun control.
Seriously, all issues aside, is it something ever that you think is ever really going to be dealt with, or do you think that forever and a day, basically, you're going to see the same sort of tap dancing in this regard that we've always seen?
I think we'll continue tap dancing until there is such a time, and again, it would never happen. In order for the government to step in and say, okay, no one can have guns anymore, then how are they going to do it? We don't have the manpower, we don't have the politics, and our government is not set up to kick the doors in and search everyone's houses in 350 million people and go from basement to attic and find every single gun out there. It's just not going to happen. So what you do is you try to either make it harder for legal gun owners to possess guns, or you start enforcing the existing gun laws to get those guns off the street. The other issue, too, is I see a lot of times is when you trace back to where the guns came from, like, say, gang violence, and whenever police go in and they confiscate weapons, where are those guns coming from? They were legal guns at one point, but how did they fall into the hands of criminals? Now, they were either stolen from individuals, they were stolen from stores. The other thing, too, is what happens is that when police departments confiscate guns, let's say, for example, the police department confiscates 1,000 guns. A major city confiscates 1,000 illegal guns in a year. Once the trials are done and those guns are no longer required for evidence, the police department has an option of either destroying those guns or then selling them at auction. So those 1,000 guns that they confiscated go right back on the street to the highest bidder.
It's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, it doesn't. I've got to say, from where we sit, doesn't make a lot of sense. My friend, as always, it has been a pleasure. We'll catch up with you again next week. Don't forget, if you'd like to be Richard's friend on Facebook, Richard S. Kazimer is where you'd find him. Kazimer, by the way, is spelled Kazimer. Meantime, my friend, we'll talk to you next week.
Looking forward to it.